Okay, so hear me out. Over the summer, I became completely absorbed by natural dyeing, and here we are. Learning how to dye with plants, mushrooms, and lichens is something I've always been fascinated by, but I never really had a quote unquote reason to get into it because I wasn't doing any fiber crafts. But ever since I learned how to knit, it's kind of been floating around in the back of my mind. And finally, this summer, I just went for it. This video won't be a how-to guide. I have no business teaching other people how to do this. I'm very much a beginner and I'm really inexperienced. So I won't be explaining the whole process or why I'm doing everything I'm doing, but I will link some resources in the description box below. So let me show you what I've got so far. I began by exploring what kind of dye plants were available to me locally, and I was so pleased to learn I had a wide variety growing in my neighborhood, my local forests, and in my garden. Amongst them are common trees like birch, wild plants like heather, weeds such as ducks, and invasive species like Canadian goldenrod. Getting plant materials seemed easy enough. Getting a hold of the equipment I needed was a bit harder, and I ended up spending more on it than I thought I would. In most cases, you need to mordant the yarn before you can dye with plants, and those chemicals can be a bit pricey. And not to mention the cost of yarn itself, you'll probably need a lot of yarn. Had I decided to do this earlier in the year, I could have planned differently. I could probably have thrifted more of the items. Instead, I really only got the pots secondhand, which would have been incredibly expensive had I bought them brand new. Keep in mind though, anything you use for dyeing should, generally speaking, never be used for cooking again for safety reasons. Okay, so here's my setup. Camping tables, a waterproof tablecloth, a chair, various large pots of different materials, a couple of electric hot plates, one induction, one regular, an old electric kettle, a couple of thermometers, pH paper, jewelry weight or letter weight, a few measuring spoons, various boil-proof mesh bags for holding plant materials, alum mordant, beginner-friendly and not dangerous, cream of tartar, potassium carbonate, iron sulfate, copper sulfate, which is a different kind of mordant, which is quite toxic, but it gives other kinds of results than alum. A bag of tannins, a couple of books on the subject, I'll link these below. A notebook, it's very important to write down what you're doing. Paper cups for mixing and dissolving stuff. Plastic buckets, you'll need a whole bunch of buckets. Something you can use to stir the yarn with when it's in the dye bath. Masks, even if something is safe to ingest and not dangerous to the environment, doesn't make it safe to inhale necessarily. Rubber gloves, the thick kind. You'll be handling a lot of hot, highly pigmented stuff, and that's pretty much it. I forgot to add a towel, scissors, a strainer, as well as citric acid, vinegar and or ammonia to regulate pH when necessary. pH can change everything. Now don't be alarmed by the amount of stuff. You don't need all of this to get started. There probably are a lot of shortcuts to be made here, but I was just concerned about getting good results on my first try, and I didn't want to risk making mistakes by cutting corners. But I did make a lot of mistakes. I mordanted my yarn a couple of days in advance using only alum. I used Mel Sweetnam's recommended method, which I will link down below. Most dye plants produce yellow, and by extension green, because yellow is easy to modify. Like if you dye yellow on grey wool, you get some kind of a green depending on the shade of grey and the shade of yellow. Canadian goldenrod, while beautiful, is one of the most invasive and ecologically disruptive plants in Europe, but it also produces one of the strongest yellow dyes in the plant kingdom, as far as I know, and it is, in my opinion, a great place to start. When you're dyeing, no, this doesn't sound right. When you start to dye, no. You should wear clothes you don't mind staining, because accidents can happen. And you should also wear boots or wellies. First, I chopped the plants into smaller pieces. You generally want to cut stuff up as much as possible, and for some unexplainable reason I kept forgetting to do that, which probably messed up some of my results, but more on that later. I simmered the goldenrods at 80 degrees Celsius for about an hour. Then I strained the plant material, and this is why you don't want to be wearing Crocs or sandals or textile shoes. I kept spilling hot water on my toes while doing this, which I do not recommend. I then added preheated wool and watched in awe as it took the color immediately. You need to slowly preheat the wool to a similar temperature as the dye bath, because it will felt if the temperature shifts are too sudden. I let it simmer for an hour, occasionally moving the yarn around to get an even color. I then picked some oak leaves from the garden, as I'd seen some amazing results on social media, but spoiler, this didn't work out in the slightest. Cutting up the leaves would have helped though. I probably used too much yarn as well. And then my fun was interrupted by surprise rain showers, and I suddenly had to move the whole boiling operation indoors, which was pretty stressful and, not to mention, really heavy. But I managed to finish up in the kitchen. The next day it was pouring, so I kept on dyeing indoors. I was only doing Yarrow, which doesn't have problematic vapors, so I wasn't too concerned about it. But why I didn't change into my dyeing clothes, I don't know. To cut some corners this time, I tried a different method where you keep the plant material in a bag and you heat it up together with the yarn, so you don't have to do it separately. You save yourself a couple of steps here. If you don't put the plant material in a bag, you'll be picking plant bits out of your yarn forever, so be warned about that. When the plant parts have simmered long enough, you remove the bag and let the yarn flow freely in the dye bath for another hour or however long it's supposed to take. It seemed to work very well. I used this method a few more times after this, and some of the results were kind of meh, others were really nice. If you have to do your dyeing indoors, make sure you're in a well-ventilated area. Once it stopped raining, I took my chances and moved the operation back outside again. I really have to start doing this under a roof. I will have to figure something out. My next attempt was birch leaves. They give a slightly different shade of yellow depending on when you pick them. If you pick them in spring, the yellow will be very bright, but if you pick them more towards the end of the season, the yellow will be browner and more muted, which sounds good to me. But these were picked in July, so I guess they're kind of middle of the road. I hope there is a more efficient way to do this. And why am I doing it without gloves? My poor hands were suffering during this. Why? I used the same method here as I did with the Yarrow earlier. Notice that dark grey hank. It will turn into the most amazing mossy green, which I'll show you towards the end of this video. After all of these and many more experiments, I had a lot of not so exciting results that I wanted to modify in an iron bath. Iron saddens colors, meaning it turns them darker and more muted, and it also turns yellow pigments green, so that's very nice. I unfortunately don't remember the concentration I used of iron sulfate or how many minutes I left it in, because I forgot to write it down. And it matters because every minute counts with iron. The yarn goes brittle if you leave it in for too long. So that's not great. I forgot to use a different pot for the iron. This one is now basically ruined, as well as the wooden spoon, because iron contaminates everything. And I don't know if I can scrub them completely free of iron residue, so these will be my iron things for now. Have you noticed my cat, by the way? When you're done, you have to rinse out the iron immediately or it will just keep eating away at the yarn. Now let's look at the results. And just so you know, capturing these colors on camera was really hard. Every hank I'm showing you is a little bit more saturated in real life, but the camera kept dulling the colors. First up is Canadian Goldenrod. These ones have not been modified with iron. The color variations here are only from different shades of naturally grey yarn, which is pretty neat. I'm very happy with how these turned out. These two goldenrods have been modified with iron, and I love how the green got deeper and mossier from it. And this is Canadian Goldenrod on superwash wool, which always takes dye a lot better than untreated wool does. The yellow is really bright and strong, and the green was the same shade, but it's been modified with iron, so this is before and after iron. I love this green, I love how deep and warm it is. I don't really go for bright yellows myself, but it's good to know that Canadian Goldenrod makes a great base for greens. This trio is dyed using birch leaves. None of these have been treated with iron. The green one in the middle is the dark grey wool from before, and I love this green, it's just what I hoped for. It was absolutely worth the extra time it took to pick those leaves. And then we have Comfrey. As you can see, the yellow is quite dull, and with iron or on grey wool it produced a sagey kind of a green, which I'm not so crazy about. I won't try Comfrey again. Oak leaves with and without iron. Now this was a huge fail. I thought the oak leaves would produce a green as I had seen online, so when that didn't happen I wanted to modify the tannins from the leaves with iron to create an almost black color, because that's what happens when iron reacts with tannins. So since I only managed to turn the white yarn grey, it means there wasn't much tannins from the leaves on the yarn. Cutting up the leaves would have helped. I'll try tannins from acorns with iron another time. Acorns are much richer in tannins, so I'm excited to try that. Tansy is another good one. The dark green is modified with iron and I love the result. So Tansy is another yellow that gives a nice foundation for rich, warm greens, it seems. And then there's the Yarrow, which is another one I'm not crazy about. These have all been modified with iron, and they were a somewhat dull yellow, and the iron turned them into a sage green, which can be a fine shade of green, but this isn't a color I would go for. I would never wear this or make anything from it. I'll save Yarrow for making tea. And finally, going out on a bang, there's Dyer's Chamomile. This is probably my favorite so far. Both the green and the yellow are absolutely gorgeous. The green is just a perfect mossy green dyed on grey wool, there's no iron involved here, and the yellow is more mustardy in real life, which is a type of yellow I really like. This is just what I was hoping for. This is my big bag of fails, but no worries, I can just keep over dyeing them until I'm happy with the results. I don't have to remordant the yarn or anything like that. And if I'm never happy with the results, I can always just dye it black. As you can probably tell, I have absolutely fallen in love with natural dyeing, and I'm researching and planning out my future dye garden. I kinda randomly already have a few good dyers growing here, like dyers chamomile, calendula and woad, which I've been growing as ornamentals. I've been collecting seeds of dye plants for a few years as well, but they can be really hard to get a hold of here in Norway, so it's taken some time, and some species are difficult to germinate and grow as well. But I managed to get a hold of and grow madder, dyer's weld, dyer's plumeless sovewort, and many others, and they're all currently happily growing in my garden. It's gonna take a while to establish enough plants for dyeing. I mean, like a big enough population of plants, and madder, for instance, takes years to mature into a good dyer, so this is a bit of a process, but I'm having so much fun with it and I'm learning so much. Meanwhile, the forests are full of mushrooms this year, and mushroom dyeing will be the next stop on this natural dyeing journey, so stay tuned for that.